There is a small bag of plain white rice sitting in your pantry right now, and I am about to show you what it can do to a plant that has not flowered in years. Not a hint, not a slight improvement. A genuine transformation, the kind that makes people in the comments ask if I am joking. I am not. And the reason almost nobody has shown you this before is not complicated. It is that there is no money in telling you the thing already sitting in your kitchen cabinet works better than what they are selling you at the garden center. I want to be upfront about something before I show you exactly what this is and how to use it, because the explanation matters as much as the technique itself. This is not a trick, and it is not a one-time miracle that happens to work on camera and nowhere else. There is a real reason this works, rooted in what is actually inside that pantry staple. And once you understand the mechanism, you will see why it works on practically anything you grow, whether that is a houseplant sitting quietly in a corner or a perennial bed out in your backyard that has been underperforming for seasons. I am going to walk you through exactly what this ingredient is, how to prepare it correctly, and how to apply it so you get real results rather than a disappointing half measure. I think it is worth pausing on why this particular plant problem, the stalled or stagnant flowering plant, frustrates so many people more than almost any other plant care issue. A plant with yellowing leaves or visible pest damage gives you something concrete to diagnose and fix. A plant that simply refuses to bloom season after season while otherwise looking perfectly healthy leaves you with nothing obvious to correct. You water it on schedule, you give it the light the tag recommends, and it just sits there, green and stubborn, producing leaf after leaf with no sign of a flower bud anywhere. That particular kind of plant frustration, the quiet, invisible kind where nothing looks technically wrong but nothing is happening either, is exactly the problem this rice flower technique was built to solve, because the missing ingredient in that scenario is almost never light or water. It is a substrate that has gone nutritionally and microbially quiet, and that is a problem you cannot see just by looking at the leaves. I am going to walk you through the entire process today, exactly how I do it, from turning plain dry rice into a fine flour, to mixing the liquid solution, to applying it correctly, depending on whether your plant is currently blooming or sitting somewhere doing absolutely nothing. This technique works on essentially every flowering plant variety you are likely to grow, indoors or outdoors. Among houseplants, that means the most delicate orchids, anthuriums, and ordinary leafy greenery. But it extends just as well into the garden bed, and I want to be specific about that, because a lot of viewers assume a kitchen ingredient fertilizer like this one is strictly an indoor trick. It is not. Roses respond beautifully to this routine. So do hydrangeas, peonies, daylilies, coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, and salvia, all genuinely common perennial garden plants that benefit from exactly the same weekly nutrient and microbiome boost as a stagnant houseplant on your windowsill. I have genuinely been surprised by how dramatically a stagnant, years without a single bud plant, whether it is in a pot indoors or a bed outside, can wake back up once its root zone gets a real dose of these nutrients on a consistent weekly schedule. Stay with me through the whole process, because the application strategy in the second half of this video, the part where I explain exactly which plants need this treatment and why, is where most people get this technique wrong and end up disappointed with their results. Before we dive in, I have a major announcement. The gardening guide you have been writing to me about for months is finally here. The Plant Once Garden is officially out. It is roughly 150 pages of everything this channel teaches, with a hand-drawn heritage cover and warm cream pages that feel like your grandmother's own gardening guide. Inside, 90 perennials that come back every year with almost no labor, 6 garden plans, the planting calendar, and the hydrogen peroxide method explained completely. Scan the QR code on your screen now, or click the link in the pinned comment or description below to get your copy. Thank you for your patience. Now, back to the garden. Let's talk about what you actually need for this, because the ingredient list could not be shorter or more accessible. You need exactly 100 grams of dry raw rice, and it genuinely does not matter what type. White rice, brown rice, jasmine, basmati, whatever bag happens to be sitting in your pantry works equally well, because the nutrient profile we are after lives inside the grain itself, not in any particular variety. You will also need a food processor or high-powered blender, a kitchen scale, a standard tablespoon, 1 liter of clean water, and a pitcher large enough to comfortably hold that liter. That is the complete list. No specialty store, no online order, nothing beyond what is already in your kitchen right now. The first step is simply weighing out your rice, and I want to give you one detail here that genuinely matters more than people expect. Use your kitchen scale to measure out exactly 100 grams of dry rice, and make sure those grains are completely dry before you move on to the blending stage. This sounds like an obvious point, but it trips people up more often than you would think. If there is any residual moisture on the rice, from humidity in your kitchen, from a bag that was not sealed properly, or from rice that was rinsed and not fully dried, the blending process will not produce a fine powder. Instead, that moisture will react with the friction and heat of the blending blades and turn your rice into a gummy, clumped paste, rather than the light, uniform flour you actually want. So before you measure, give your rice a quick visual check. If it looks or feels even slightly damp, spread it out and let it air dry for an hour before proceeding. Once your 100 grams are measured and you have confirmed the rice is fully dry, pour it directly into the bowl of your food processor or blender. Secure the lid tightly, because what happens next involves genuinely vigorous motion, and you do not want rice grains escaping mid-process. Run the processor on high speed for exactly 2 minutes, without pausing or stopping partway through. I want to be specific about that 2-minute mark, because this is another detail that separates a usable rice flour from one that will clog your sprayer or fail to dissolve properly later. Rice grains are dense, and breaking them down into the kind of ultra-fine, uniform powder that will dissolve smoothly in water takes sustained processing time, not just a few quick pulses. Stopping the blender early, at 30 seconds or a minute, will leave you with a coarse, gritty texture that includes partially broken grain fragments rather than true flour, and those larger fragments will settle at the bottom of your mixing container instead of staying suspended in the water where your plant's roots can actually access the nutrients. After the full 2 minutes, open the lid and take a look at what you have produced. You are looking for a fine, uniform white powder with a texture similar to commercially made rice flour. If you run your fingers through it and still feel distinct grainy particles, give it another 30 seconds to a minute of processing. Most home blenders and food processors will get you to the right consistency within the standard 2-minute window. But blender power does vary, and it is worth that extra check before moving forward. Once you have your fine rice flour, you can store any extra in a sealed container in a cool, dry place for future batches. Since 100 grams of rice will typically produce more flour than you need for a single liter of fertilizer solution, and there is no reason to start from scratch every single week. It is worth understanding, even briefly, why this particular grinding step matters so much, rather than simply soaking whole rice grains directly in water and skipping the blender entirely. A whole, unprocessed rice grain has an intact outer structure that resists breaking down quickly in plain water at room temperature. Left to soak as whole grains, the nutrients trapped inside would release slowly, unevenly, and over a timeline measured in days, rather than the immediate, fully available solution you want for a weekly fertilizing routine. Grinding the rice into fine flour dramatically increases the surface area exposed to water, which is the entire reason the dissolving step in stage 2 works as quickly and completely as it does. Surface area is doing the real work here, not some chemical transformation, and that is also part of why the type of rice you use barely matters. A grain of white rice and a grain of brown rice differ slightly in fiber content and processing history, but once both are reduced to a fine powder, with a comparable surface area exposed to water, the practical nutrient delivery to your plant ends up functionally similar. I want to pause here and explain honestly why home-ground rice flour works just as well as the rice flour you could buy ready-made at a health food store. Because some viewers have understandably asked whether store-bought rice flour, which has often been processed and sometimes bleached or treated, delivers the same nutrient benefit. The answer is that for this specific application, grinding your own rice at home is actually the more reliable choice. Commercially processed rice flour can vary depending on the milling process, and some products strip away the bran layer of the rice during processing, which is exactly where a meaningful portion of the mineral content is concentrated. When you grind raw, whole rice at home yourself, you know precisely what went into that flour, and you preserve the complete nutrient profile of the grain rather than a partially stripped version of it. This is one of those rare cases where doing it yourself, in your own kitchen, genuinely outperforms the store-bought convenience option, not just matches it. With your rice flour ready, it is time to turn it into the actual liquid solution you will be applying to your plants, and this stage is wonderfully simple, though there are still a couple of details worth getting exactly right. Measure out 1 liter of clean water into your mixing pitcher or container. Tap water is perfectly fine for this. You do not need filtered or distilled water for a fertilizer solution like this one. Then take exactly 1 heaping tablespoon of your freshly processed rice flour and add it directly into the water. I want to be precise about that heaping tablespoon measurement, because, much like the lemon ratio in some of my other root rescue techniques, the dosage here matters for a specific reason. Too little rice flour and you are essentially watering your plant with diluted starch water that does not deliver a meaningful nutrient dose. Too much, and you risk creating conditions in the soil that favor mold growth, or an overly rich substrate that can actually attract gnats and other pests rather than simply feeding your plant. 1 heaping tablespoon per liter of water is the ratio that delivers a genuinely effective dose of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium without overcorrecting into a problem you did not have before. Once the flour is in the water, stir the mixture vigorously with a spoon. You are not just folding the powder in gently here. You want real agitation, enough to fully dissolve the flour and suspend it evenly throughout the liquid, rather than letting it clump or settle immediately at the bottom of your container. Continue stirring until the water takes on a consistent, rich, milky white appearance from top to bottom, with no visible clumps of undissolved powder floating or settled anywhere in the container. This visual cue, that uniform milky color, is your indicator that the solution is properly mixed and ready to use. If you let the mixture sit for more than a few minutes before applying it, give it one more quick stir before pouring, since some settling can occur even in a well-mixed batch, particularly with the slightly coarser flour you get from a home blender compared to commercially milled flour. One honest note here about shelf life, since I get asked this regularly. This rice flour solution does not store well once mixed with water. Because it is an organic nutrient suspension rather than a stabilized commercial product, bacteria and mold can begin developing in the liquid within a day or two, especially in a warm kitchen. Mix only what you plan to use that same day, and treat any leftover liquid as something to use immediately, rather than something to save for next week's application. The dry rice flour itself, on the other hand, stores beautifully in a sealed container for weeks, so there is no harm in grinding a larger batch of flour at once and mixing fresh liquid solution each time you are ready to apply it. By the way, if you're looking to completely transform your yard into a low-maintenance paradise, don't forget that my full reference guide, The Plant Once Garden, is now officially available. It's 150 pages covering all the perennial foundations and permanent setups we talk about on this channel. You can scan the QR code right here on the screen, or find the link in the pinned comment below to grab your copy. Now, let's move on. This is the part of the process where I see the most people go wrong, not because the fertilizer itself fails them, but because they apply it the same way to every single plant in their home, without thinking about what that particular plant actually needs at that particular moment. There are genuinely two different situations where this rice flour solution does very different jobs, and understanding the distinction is what separates someone who gets a modest, forgettable result from someone who watches their entire plant collection transform. The first situation is a plant that is currently blooming, healthy, and actively putting out flowers. For these plants, the rice flour solution functions primarily as a support and longevity treatment. The calcium and magnesium in the solution help reinforce the structural integrity of the existing blossoms, essentially giving the cell walls within the flower tissue more strength to resist the natural wilting and degradation that comes with age. Applied weekly to an already blooming plant, you are not necessarily trying to trigger something new. You are extending the lifespan of what is already happening, keeping those blooms vibrant and intact for noticeably longer than they would last with water alone. The second situation is entirely different, and it is the one that tends to produce the most dramatic, almost startling results. This is the plant, sitting quietly in a corner of your home, that you have essentially given up on. The one that came home from the nursery covered in flowers, dropped every single bloom within a few weeks, and has sat there ever since, putting out leaves occasionally but never producing another bud. Or the plant that has gone a full year, sometimes multiple years, without flowering at all, despite what feels like reasonable care. For these stagnant, dormant plants, the rice flour solution does something genuinely different at the soil level. The nutrient surge does not just feed the plant directly, it feeds the native microorganism population living in the substrate itself, the bacteria and beneficial fungi that break down organic matter and make nutrients bioavailable to plant roots in the first place. A dormant, understimulated substrate has a sluggish, inactive microbiome, and feeding that microbiome consistently over several weeks essentially shocks the entire root zone back into an active state, which in turn signals to the plant that conditions have genuinely improved enough to justify investing energy into new growth and flower bud formation again. This is the honest mechanism behind why the same simple fertilizer produces what looks like two different effects depending on which plant you apply it to. It is not magic, and it is not that the rice flour somehow knows what each plant needs. It is that a currently blooming plant and a currently dormant plant are simply starting from two different baseline conditions, and the same nutrient and microbial boost interacts with each of those starting points differently. Knowing which category your plant falls into before you start your weekly applications will help you set realistic expectations and recognize the signs of progress as they actually appear, rather than expecting instant transformation from a plant that needed weeks of consistent microbiome activation before it would even consider producing a new bud. It is worth being specific about what the signs of early progress actually look like on a dormant plant, because the changes in the first couple of weeks are subtle, and people who do not know what to watch for sometimes assume nothing is happening yet. Before you see anything resembling a flower bud, you will typically notice the leaf color deepen slightly, particularly on plants that had been a paler, more washed-out green from sitting in nutrient-poor soil for an extended period. New leaf growth, where it appears, will often come in noticeably larger and more vigorous than the leaves the plant was producing before you started the treatment. These are the visible signals that the substrate microbiome is waking up and the plant is beginning to redirect energy toward growth rather than simple survival, and they typically show up in the second or third week, well before any bud formation becomes visible. If you see this kind of leaf improvement happening on schedule, that is a genuinely reliable sign that the flowering response is coming, even if it has not arrived yet. Once your liquid solution is mixed, and you understand which category your plant falls into, the application itself is refreshingly simple. Pour the milky rice flour solution directly onto the soil or substrate at the base of your plant, distributing it around the root zone rather than concentrating it in a single spot. You are not spraying this onto leaves or flowers. This is strictly a root-level soil application, since the nutrients need to reach the root system and, in the case of dormant plants, the surrounding substrate microbiome, to have any meaningful effect. The schedule that works best, and the one I recommend across the board regardless of which type of plant you are treating, is once every 7 days, applied as a consistent, ongoing routine rather than a one-time treatment. I want to be honest about why weekly consistency matters so much here, because this is where a lot of people undermine their own results without realizing it. A single application of rice flour solution delivers a small nutrient dose that your plant's root system absorbs over the following days. But it is not a one-and-done fix, particularly for a dormant plant that needs its substrate microbiome rebuilt over time rather than instantly. Skipping weeks, or applying it inconsistently whenever you happen to remember, means the microbial activity in the soil never builds the sustained momentum it needs to meaningfully shift the plant's growth behavior. Treat this the way you would treat a consistent watering schedule rather than an occasional treat, and the results compound noticeably over the following weeks. I also want to address something that genuinely matters for getting this technique to work as intended, because it is the detail most likely to leave someone disappointed despite doing everything else correctly. This rice flower fertilizer is not a replacement for the basic care requirements your specific plant species needs. It is a supplement layered on top of appropriate watering frequency and the correct amount of sunlight exposure for that particular plant. An orchid that is being kept in a dim corner with inconsistent watering is not going to burst into bloom just because you started adding rice flour solution to its weekly routine. The fundamentals still have to be right. What this fertilizer does is take a plant that already has reasonably appropriate light and water conditions and gives its root zone and substrate microbiome the additional nutrient support needed to push past stagnation into active growth and flowering. Think of it as removing one genuine obstacle to blooming, not as a substitute for getting the other basics correct. I want to set honest expectations here rather than promise you an overnight transformation, because the timeline genuinely depends on which category your plant falls into and how long it has been sitting in its current state. For a plant that is already blooming and simply receiving this treatment as a support measure, you will often notice the difference within the very first week or two, primarily in how much longer the existing flowers hold their color, firmness, and overall structural integrity compared to blooms that received water alone. For a genuinely dormant or stagnant plant, the one that has gone months or years without flowering, the timeline is understandably longer, because you are not just feeding the plant directly, you are rebuilding an entire microbial ecosystem in the substrate before that plant's root system even begins signaling to the rest of the plant that conditions have meaningfully improved. In my own experience, and from what other experienced growers using this method consistently report, somewhere in the range of 3 to 6 weeks of consistent weekly applications is a realistic window before you start seeing new bud formation on a plant that had been completely stagnant. Some plants respond faster, particularly if the underlying issue was primarily a nutrient deficiency rather than a deeper problem with light or watering conditions. Others take the full 6 weeks or slightly longer, especially if the plant had been neglected for an extended period before you started this routine. I think it is worth being honest about the plants where this technique is less likely to produce the dramatic result you are hoping for, because not every flowering failure comes down to nutrients. If a plant is sitting in genuinely inadequate light, far below what that species requires to support flowering regardless of nutrient availability, the rice flour solution will support overall plant health and leaf color, but it is unlikely to trigger blooming on its own until the light situation is also corrected. Similarly, a plant that is being significantly overwatered or underwatered relative to its needs has a more fundamental stress factor at play that no amount of soil nutrition will fully resolve. The honest picture here is that this fertilizer removes the nutrient and microbiome obstacle specifically, and for the very large number of houseplants where that nutrient gap is the actual limiting factor holding back flowering, the results genuinely are as dramatic as a handful of vivid white powder transforming into a windowsill full of blooms might suggest. But pair the routine with the right light and water for your specific plant, and do not expect it to override fundamentally wrong growing conditions on its own. A few additional practical notes worth knowing as you start incorporating this into your regular plant care routine. This solution is genuinely mild enough to use across nearly every plant variety you are likely to own, indoors or outdoors, including notably sensitive plants like orchids and anthuriums that can react poorly to harsher synthetic fertilizers. But mild does not mean you should abandon the weekly dosing guideline in favor of more frequent applications hoping for faster results. More frequent applications beyond the recommended weekly schedule do not accelerate the microbiome building process meaningfully, and instead risk the mold and pest issues that come with oversaturating your substrate with organic nutrient matter. Stick to the once-a-week rhythm even if you do not see immediate results in the first few applications, because the soil microbiology genuinely does need that pacing to build properly. If you are applying this in an outdoor garden bed rather than a contained pot, the same weekly routine and dosage still apply, but you will naturally need a larger total volume of solution depending on how many plants you are treating. Scale the recipe up proportionally, keeping the same ratio of 1 heaping tablespoon of rice flour per liter of water, and mix a larger batch in a watering can or garden sprayer rather than a small pitcher. Among the perennials I recommend this for most often. Roses show some of the most visible improvement in both bloom size and how long each flush lasts. Hydrangeas respond well too, particularly stressed or recently transplanted ones. Daylilies, coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, and salvia are all reliable candidates, especially in beds where the soil has been worked hard for several seasons. I also want to mention, since this comes up in the comments whenever I cover homemade plant fertilizers, that this rice flour solution is not intended to replace a complete fertilization program for plants with very heavy feeding requirements, such as certain flowering vegetables or particularly demanding ornamental varieties. For the vast majority of common flowering plants, the nutrient profile in this solution genuinely covers what is needed. But if you are growing something with unusually intensive nutritional demands, this works wonderfully as a weekly supplement layered into a broader care routine rather than as the sole source of nutrition for that plant. There is something I find genuinely satisfying about a technique like this one, beyond just the practical results. There is a particular kind of quiet confidence that comes from realizing the plant care industry has spent years selling complicated, expensive solutions to a problem that a bag of rice already sitting in your kitchen cabinet can solve just as effectively. Every week that you mix this solution and pour it around the base of a plant that has been stubbornly refusing to bloom, you are essentially placing a small, patient bet that consistency and proper nutrition will eventually pay off, even when the plant in front of you is giving you very little visible reason for optimism in those early weeks. And when those first new buds finally do appear on a plant you had genuinely written off, there is a real sense of vindication in that moment, the kind that comes specifically from having trusted a simple, almost absurdly accessible process over the more expensive options the industry typically pushes. This is also, I think, a useful technique to keep in your back pocket, simply because it scales so easily to however many plants you happen to be caring for. A single batch of rice flour, ground once and stored properly, can supply weeks of weekly fertilizing sessions across an entire windowsill or plant shelf without any additional cost beyond the rice itself. For anyone managing a genuinely large plant collection, where commercial liquid fertilizers start to add up in cost surprisingly quickly once you are dosing a dozen or more pots every single week, the economics of this approach are honestly hard to beat. You are looking at pennies per application, sourced from an ingredient most kitchens already have on hand, delivering the same core nutrients that the expensive bottled alternatives are charging a premium for. If you have plants at home right now that fall into either category I described today, whether they are currently blooming and you want to extend that display as long as possible, or they are sitting quietly in a corner having given up on flowering entirely, I would genuinely encourage you to start this weekly routine this week rather than waiting. Weigh out your 100 grams of rice. Run it through your blender for 2 minutes. Mix your tablespoon into a liter of water and start the habit. 3 to 6 weeks from now, depending on where that particular plant started, you may be looking at buds and blooms where there has been nothing but stagnant green leaves for longer than you would like to admit. I hope this process brings the same kind of result to your plants that it has consistently brought to mine and to so many other growers who have written in after trying this. If you give this a try, drop a comment below and let me know which plants you are using it on and how things progress over the coming weeks, because I genuinely read through every comment on these videos, and your results and questions shape what I cover in future ones. If this was helpful, subscribe to Garden Roots for more honest, step-by-step plant care content built for people who would rather understand why a method works than just follow instructions blindly. If you are ready to stop losing plants every winter and finally build a garden that takes care of itself, grab your copy of The Plant Once Garden, 150 pages of everything this channel teaches, mapped out for you. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link in the description to get started. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today, and I will see you in the next one.